What is up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and last week we got a game that I was so excited for. It was actually one of my most anticipated games of 2025, and the game that I'm referring to, of course, is Death Stranding 2. And since I'm doing this video, I've obviously played the game and I want to talk about it. So without further ado, let's rock. Death Stranding 2, of course, is a sequel to the 2019 game. It, like the first game, was developed by Kojima Productions and published by Sony. Therefore, it is exclusive to PlayStation 5. I'm sure eventually it will come to PC in a few years, as the first game did. I just recently played the director's cut of the first game on my brand new PC earlier this year, so I'm sure it's going to follow that same playbook. I should mention with this video that I'm actually only 30 hours in, maybe a little bit more than 30 hours into Death Stranding 2, and with most games you could probably beat the whole game in less than 30 hours. However, my first playthrough of the first game took me a little over 90 hours, so just doing a little bit of math, that means I'm probably only about a third of the way through Death Stranding 2. So obviously this video is going to be my first impressions, not my full review. Death Stranding 2, like the first game, follows Sam Porter, played once again by Norman Reedus, who is now hiding out with his BB named Lou. Fragile tracks them down to ask Sam to work his chiral network magic on Mexico. And like I said earlier, Death Stranding 2 is one of my most anticipated games of the year. If I remember correctly, it was actually my third most anticipated game of 2025. And one of the reasons for that, of course, I enjoyed the first game, but also I'm just a huge fan of Kojima. Playing the first Metal Gear Solid game on the original PlayStation was like a seminal moment in my gaming journey. It was like nothing I had ever experienced before. I think I've told this story on this channel before, but literally my younger brother would literally watch me play this game. Before he ever even played Metal Gear Solid, he had just watched me play it. It's that like cinematic and different than any other gaming experience we've ever had. And since then, I've been a huge fan of Kojima ever since. And while the first game is far from perfect, there is something to be said about when you play a Kojima game, it is a truly unique experience. Whether you know who he is or not, you can just feel it that you're playing a different type of game. And honestly, if you're part of the hive that chalked up the first Death Stranding game as just kind of a quote unquote walking sim, and you say that like it's a bad thing and you didn't really like the first game, I'll be real honest with you, you might as well just stop right now, because there's nothing the sequel is going to do to kind of change those people's minds. Obviously, I don't agree with that mindset because I did enjoy the first game, but if that's your opinion, first of all, I don't think you're watching this video in the first place, but you're probably not going to like the sequel. My wife was literally watching me playing the sequel, and she was like, man, I just wanted to watch you play the game that you wouldn't shut up about. And it looks exactly like the first game. And she's not wrong. Like I said earlier, I did play the director's cut of the first game recently, and they did add a lot of quality of life improvements to the original game in the director's cut. And I'm being 100% transparent. The first, I would say 8 to 10 hours of Death Stranding 2 did kind of feel like I was playing the game again, the director's cut again. But once you essentially are done connecting Mexico and get access to the DHV Magellan, the game really kind of starts to stretch its legs and starts to become kind of its own game. So if you're patient with this game and willing to give it a little bit of time, 30 hours in, I feel confident in saying that this is a superior game to the first Death Stranding in almost every way possible. Now, I will start off talking about an area that I'm not quite ready to say is better than the original, and that is the story. And it has nothing to do with how I feel about the story of the sequel. I've actually really enjoyed the story so far. I will just point out that Kojima games are obviously kind of weird and the stories are kind of hard to follow. I will say that the first Death Stranding story is very hard to follow. I will say it's a little bit more streamlined. At least the story I've seen so far has felt a lot easier to understand. Now, again, I've played the original when it launched, and then I've played the director's cut as well. So I've experienced this world for a while. So maybe it's easier for me because of that. Now, without spoiling anything, there is a huge story moment that happens, I would say, within the first handful of hours of this game that is absolutely heartbreaking. Based on that moment and some of the side character stuff that I've already seen, it does feel like this game is centered around grief and how people deal with losing somebody. And I don't want to get super personal in a video game review, but I did lose somebody very close to me a few years ago, and I still have a hard time with it. It'll just kind of hit you in weird ways every so often. And so a game like this that deals with that sort of pain is something that is going to connect with me. All that being said, just the nature of this video being a first impressions video, I don't want to say much more about the story because honestly I haven't got to see much of it, but I will just say so far so good. And I do want to point out, I do think that the pacing of the story is far superior to the first game. It felt like in the first game you would have long stretches of gameplay without any major story moments. In the sequel, it feels like they sprinkled in smaller story moments a lot more frequently, so it wasn't like you were going real long stretches before you got those moments. And I will say that there's especially a lot of really cool moments with the side characters that you meet along the way that I definitely appreciated. Now, as far as this video is concerned and trying to avoid spoilers, I should also point out kind of an editing decision I made while I was playing this game. Since that big moment, that big story moment that I mentioned earlier happens early in the game, there are a lot of cutscenes that will have characters discussing that moment and things that I think are kind of spoilery. So I'm still going to include cutscenes in this video just because this is a beautiful game and I want to show that game off, but I will be blurring out the dialogue in an effort not to spoil anything. But before we move on, I do have one last thing I want to say about the story. And because this is a sequel, and I do want to give the game credit, it does try to do its best to catch you up. There is like this recap slideshow available in the menu, but it does kind of lean heavily on the assumption that you've at least played the first game. There's a lot of lore and rules and lingo that you really have to play the first game to pick up. So you're gonna really struggle with this game if you've never played the first one. And like I said earlier, if you have played the first game, especially if you've tried the director's cut as well, the gameplay, at least for the first chunk of the game, is exactly the same. You pick up packages and you deliver them to a hologram that may or may not be modeled after a famous actor or director. Shout out to my boy, Mike Flanagan. I have yet to see Conan. I don't think he's in this game, but he was in the first game and I love Conan, so I'm hoping that I will come across his character eventually. But yeah, a lot of the delivery aspects of this game are exactly the same. Even the animation of Sam putting the cargo into the bins or on the conveyor belt is exactly the same. And that may annoy some people who want their sequels to be a lot different. I personally enjoyed making deliveries in the first game. It kind of unlocked that weird obsessive part of my gamer brain that made me want to like get 5 stars on all locations. I was that guy just kind of going back and forth between locations, picking up the randomly generated lost cargo until I had all 5 stars in the first game. And I definitely found myself falling back into that pattern in this game, which is a big part of the reason why I haven't experienced much of the story so far. That and just building the roads have basically probably been close to 10 hours of my 30 hours so far. But as I said in the intro, once you get out of Mexico, the game definitely opens up a lot and the game starts to feel a little bit different than the first game. One thing I really liked about Death Stranding 2 versus the original game is it felt like the first game had a lot of the best stuff later in the game. Like you would get a cool tool or weapon and then you barely got to use it, relatively speaking, to the 90 hours I played that game. Death Stranding 2, on the other hand, doesn't hide its best stuff behind later missions. One reason why I'm already finding myself wanting to get 5 stars at every location in Death Stranding 2 is the more stars you get, the more materials, of course, that you get, which I use those materials to build more roads, which we'll get to later, but also the more stars you get in each location, the better tools and weapons you unlock. These tools, most notably the ones that you can actually attach to your backpack, make some of the sillier, tedious parts about making these deliveries in a post-apocalyptic world way easier. You still have to work for them, you still have to make the deliveries to bump up your stars, but you have an ability to unlock them much quicker than you did in the first game. One of the first locations that you actually add to the network in Mexico gives you one of the best guns in the game. It's a sniper rifle that actually at first glance doesn't seem like it's gonna be that good because at first it isn't silenced. You can eventually unlock a silenced version at that same location, but I actually personally like that it's not silenced because you can kind of sit back and take out a couple enemies at a base and the noise actually draws them out. And you can kind of start picking them off as they run at you. And it makes taking out a whole base of enemies way easier. Speaking of taking out an entire base, it does feel like the developers went out of their way to make this game have way more combat than the first game. The combat in the first game, outside of the big boss fights that are obviously mandatory, Death Stranding 2 also has some really cool boss fights as well. The combat always felt like it was optional, like you could kind of get around the enemies. You didn't actually have to fight anybody, which is good because the combat, especially when this game first launched in 2019, it felt pretty clunky. The combat in the sequel feels like a much more critical aspect of the game, and it's not as clunky as the first game. To their credit, they did make improvements with the combat in the first game, especially with the director's cut. But even before the director's cut, they had made improvements with like updates and stuff. But if you played this game at launch, you know how clunky that combat was. So those improvements that they put in the original game after launch and then eventually with the director's cut, those improvements of course are in the sequel, plus they added some as well. But at its core, Death Stranding 2 is still a delivery sim, but there are more stealth and third-person shooter moments in the sequel versus the first game. Now on the flip side of that coin, the BT sections feel way easier in the sequel than they did in the first game. It's almost like they flipped them. In the first game, the BT sections were way more interesting and scary than the bandit sections or the combat sections. In the sequel, I felt like the BT sections were a piece of cake and the actual like bandit combat was way harder. You get blood grenades in the sequel practically at the start of the game, and as long as you have a supply of those on hand, the BT sections are a cakewalk. To be fair, it may just be because I recently just played the director's cut, so I'm well versed in dealing with BTs at this point. Maybe if you're less practiced than me, you may struggle, but I did feel like the BTs were kind of a lesser threat in this game versus the first one. But one of the biggest differences between Death Stranding and its sequel is now there's a weather cycle. And I'm not just talking about timefall, because obviously there was timefall in the original game. But in the sequel, there are now sandstorms, there's earthquakes, there's even fireballs falling from the sky. Rivers will flood with too much timefall, which will destroy the bridges that you build. So it's just another system that you have to manage. And it's kind of a perfect example of what I want from a sequel. Yes, there was a little bit of weather with the timefall in the first game, but they found an opportunity to make what I already thought was a good game even better with more weather. There's also a pseudo fast travel in the sequel. So I briefly mentioned the DHV Magellan earlier, and that's brand new to this game. It's a ship that you can travel through the tar. Sam joins the crew after connecting Mexico to the chiral network. So shortly after that, you will unlock the ability to chart a course to any location that you've added to the network. Of course, if you're on the ship, when you chart that course and they go to that location, you also get transported to that location. So it kind of works like fast travel. However, I wouldn't suggest doing this to make deliveries because you will get a worse grade on the delivery. I really only use this to help me build the roads, since you have to have a ton of materials to build the roads. So I would literally just fast travel to the different locations on the Magellan. I would store those materials that I took from the different locations on the Magellan, because you have a private locker on the Magellan, and then you could just fast travel to the closest auto paver and then take those materials to that auto paver and use it like that. Speaking of the roads, man, they make this game a lot easier. I forgot how addicting it was to pave the roads, But then also, I kind of fell into that trap I do with a lot of RPGs where I either level up my character, or in this case, I make a lot of different roads that makes the game a lot easier. And then I wonder why the game's a lot easier. It was actually kind of funny because some missions, Doll Man or Fragile will tell you, man, this delivery is going to be tough. It's going to be a pain in the ass because it's a long route that you have to go, or it's super heavy or whatever. And I keep thinking as they're telling me this, I'm like, bitch, I've made this entire road across this entire continent. I'm just going to drive my SUV with all the shit in the back, and it's not going to be hard at all. So I will say that if you're looking for a challenge with this game, maybe don't restore all the roads, because it definitely makes this game way easier than I think it was intended to be. So I just mentioned Doll Man, and I do think that I should talk about him for a bit because he's a brand new character and you do see him on a lot of the promo material. So essentially he's a new character that character's conscience was trapped in this marionette doll. Therefore, he is able to travel with Sam clipped to his hip. The easiest comparison, of course, is Mimir in God of War. However, Doll Man does have a gameplay mechanic unique to just him. You can actually use him to scout enemy camps by marking enemies before you take down the base. And you do that by tossing him up in the air. He can kind of scan the base and he can mark cargo and enemies before you charge into the base. However, for the most part, he's just gonna kind of chat with you and give you advice. All right, one last thing before I move on to how this game looks and plays, I should also mention there is a new skill tree in Death Stranding 2 called the Automated Porter Assistance System, or APAS. How this system works is very similar to a regular skill tree minus one particular section. So as you play the game, you will unlock memory, basically XP, for this system. That memory can be spent to unlock enhancements like creating an electronic field that binds cargo, making it more durable so it won't scatter when Sam falls over, or an aim assist. There's so many others. I'm not going to list them all, but you get the point. What I really like about this skill tree versus other RPGs is there's no cost to respec the enhancements that you choose. You can turn skills on and off as many times as you want. For example, if you know you're gonna start a mission that has a lot of combat, you can go into your APAS and just turn off anything that isn't combat and then turn on all the skills that make you better at combat. And that doesn't cost you anything in the game. You can do it as many times as you want. All right, so moving on to the visuals. And in one word, I can describe how this game looks. And that one word is stunning. There was a huge improvement from the first game, which I actually think is a good looking game. It was released pretty much at the end of the PS4. And then of course the director's cut was on PC and PS5 as well. So it's certainly not a bad looking game by any means whatsoever, but Death Stranding 2 on the PS5 literally looks like you're watching a movie during the cutscenes. It's insane how good this game looks. And I only played it on my regular PS5. I got this PS5 the day that it launched. I don't have a PS5 Pro, so I'd imagine it even looks better on the PS5 Pro. And the breathtaking visuals isn't just for the cutscenes, it extends to the actual gameplay itself. One of the reasons why I push back on the walking sim guys, the people that just knock on this game as just this walking sim, is that the vibe of the game is so cool. Yes, there is a lot of walking around, and some people might find that boring, but the environments and music are so awesome to look at and to listen to that I never got bored with walking around. And I feel like just calling it a walking sim is very disrespectful to the first game and of course the second game as well. And they were able to improve upon the environments and the music in the sequel. Again, I thought the visuals looked great in the first game. They improved upon that in the sequel. I thought the environments and the music was great in the first game. They improved upon it in the sequel. And that's what I want from a sequel. It's actually, the sequel is one of the rare games that I actually looked up some of the artists on Spotify because I liked the music that was playing in the game so much. I very rarely do that. And the environments do have decent variety. There are some dense forests and mountains to climb. However, if I'm being fair, a good chunk of it, due to just the nature of the game being based in both Mexico and Australia, there is a lot of desert. So you're gonna walk through a lot of desert. So it is what it is. And in that environment, there is an insane amount of detail. One of the things that I love about Kojima games so much is his insane eye for detail. As a gamer, I want to immerse myself into a video game as much as physically possible. Of course, I am always going to know that I'm playing a video game, especially a game like this, of course. But I want to immerse myself as much as physically possible. And it feels like he makes games for people that want to be immersed in the game as much as possible. A perfect example of this is, I already mentioned earlier that there are a lot of sandstorms because, like I said just a few seconds ago, you're walking through a lot of deserts. So of course there's going to be a lot of sandstorms. And so when you walk through a sandstorm, of course, Sam is going to be really dusty until you get to your private room and you take a shower. Or you can walk through the rivers and it will actually wash away the sand in the rivers. However, I personally haven't experienced this myself. I just read it. Apparently, only the parts of sand that was touched by water will have the sand washed away, which I think, again, is not a game changer by any means, but it's just that insane level of detail that I really appreciate. I do also want to point out that this game runs just as beautiful as it looks. I had zero clipping, I had zero crashes, I had zero technical issues with this game playing on my base PS5. There's almost no load times whatsoever. It's actually kind of insane that a game like this has zero loading. All right, so wrapping up this video, as I've stated a few times, I have only played about 30 hours, maybe a little bit more, into Death Stranding 2, so I won't give it a full star rating just yet. That being said, I have a hard time thinking that unless this game just completely shits the bed, which I really doubt it will, I have a hard time thinking this won't be at least in my top 5 at the end of the year, if not my game of the year, even though there's already steep competition for game of the year already. I love its early focus on grief with the story. That definitely resonated with me on a deeply personal level. Gameplay wise, it's more of what fans loved about the first game, myself included, with meaningful upgrades, expanded combat, and a new traversal systems that will keep the delivery loop feeling fresh. Visually, the game is absolutely gorgeous, blending unreal cinematic cutscenes with beautiful detailed environments that just make walking around feel immersive. So if you liked the first game, this is a deeper, more refined evolution, which is exactly what I want from a video game sequel. And if you didn't, this sequel might not change your mind, unfortunately. But as always, those are just my thoughts on Death Stranding 2. I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below. Of course, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button, as the kids say. If you especially enjoyed this video, definitely consider subscribing. If you do subscribe, ding that bell. That way you're notified every time I post another video. I try to post weekly gaming related content, which is obviously content that you're into if you've made it this far in the video. So definitely consider subscribing and dinging that bell. But until next video, take it easy. What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and this is my boy Yoshi, aka Kitty Boy, and we were just talking and we agree that since you made it this far in the video, you might as well subscribe. You wouldn't want to disappoint Kitty Boy, would you?